There comes a moment when the mask stops working. Not because they changed, but because you did. You started noticing the patterns, the contradictions, the subtle attempts to control the story. What once felt confusing now feels obvious, and that shift changes everything. People who depend on being admired, unquestioned, or emotionally in control often react when they realize their influence is fading. They sense distance, they notice silence, they feel the loss of access. Seeing clearly is powerful because once you recognize what's happening, it becomes much harder to return to old roles or old illusions. There is a point in every difficult relationship where something shifts quietly inside you. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface, no big announcement, no sudden confrontation. But internally, things begin to connect. Moments that once felt confusing start forming a pattern. Conversations you used to replay in your mind suddenly make sense. The things you dismissed, excused, or explained away no longer feel random. You begin to recognize that what looked like confidence may have been control. What looked like concern may have been influence. And what looked like closeness may have depended more on your silence than your voice. For a long time, the mask worked because you were focused on understanding, fixing, forgiving, or keeping peace. You gave the benefit of the doubt. You questioned yourself before questioning anyone else. You believed consistency would eventually appear. You assumed honesty would be returned with honesty. That willingness to see the best in people became the very reason certain behaviors stayed hidden in plain sight. But awareness changes the experience completely. You start noticing the small things, the way accountability disappears when responsibility appears, the way facts become flexible depending on who is listening, the way your reactions become the focus instead of the original issue. You notice how certain conversations leave you doubting yourself, even when you entered them feeling clear. You recognize patterns of deflection, selective memory, emotional pressure, and moments that leave you carrying emotions that were never yours to carry. And once you see it, something important happens. You stop reacting automatically. You begin observing. You become quieter, not because you are powerless, but because you are paying attention. You ask fewer questions because the answers are already in the repeated behavior. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You stop chasing understanding from people who only engage when they remain in control of the narrative. That shift is often noticed. People become uncomfortable when their usual patterns no longer create the same result. The responses become stronger. There may be confusion, irritation, unexpected kindness, subtle criticism, attempts to pull you back into old conversations, or renewed efforts to regain emotional access. Not because your value changed, but because your awareness changed. What once depended on your uncertainty now meets your clarity. And clarity is difficult to challenge, because when you begin seeing actions instead of promises, consistency instead of appearances, and patterns instead of isolated moments, the image loses its power. The performance becomes harder to maintain. The version of reality that once seemed convincing no longer feels complete. You start trusting your own observations again. You recognize that seeing clearly is not being negative, cold, or unfair. It is noticing what has always been there and allowing yourself to believe what you see. The moment awareness enters the situation, the balance begins to change. Not because you become louder, more aggressive, or more confrontational, but because you stop participating in patterns that once depended on your confusion. What changes first is often invisible. Your energy shifts. Your attention shifts. Your need for approval begins to fade. And that quiet internal change can alter the entire dynamic. Control rarely survives clear observation. When someone has become used to shaping conversations, redirecting responsibility, influencing emotions, or deciding how reality should be interpreted, they often expect those patterns to continue unnoticed. They rely on habits. They expect quick reactions, emotional explanations, endless chances, and repeated access to your attention. But awareness interrupts that cycle. You begin noticing the difference between communication and persuasion. You recognize when discussions become circular instead of productive. You become aware of how often your feelings are minimized, while someone else's perspective becomes the only acceptable version of events. You notice how difficult topics suddenly shift away from accountability and toward your tone, your timing, or your reaction. Once that awareness develops, your decisions begin to look different. You stop explaining yourself repeatedly in hopes of being understood. You stop defending things that never needed defending. You become more comfortable with silence. You stop rushing to repair tension that you did not create. You realize that not every misunderstanding needs endless effort, and not every disagreement requires proving your worth. That creates a new kind of discomfort. People who are comfortable with influence often expect predictable responses. They expect emotional access. They expect to know exactly how to trigger guilt, urgency, obligation, or self-doubt. When those responses disappear, the environment changes. The old approach stops producing the same outcome. You may notice stronger reactions, more questions, more attempts to regain closeness, more reminders of history, more efforts to redefine events. Sometimes there is sudden warmth, sometimes distance. Sometimes criticism appears exactly when confidence starts growing. Not because awareness is wrong, but because awareness reduces the power of confusion. And confusion is often what kept the imbalance alive. The more clearly you see patterns, the less dependent you become on outside validation. You begin trusting what you consistently observe, instead of waiting for permission to believe it. You understand that clarity is not cruelty, and boundaries are not rejection. You recognize that protecting your peace does not require anger, and understanding someone does not obligate you to accept everything they do. Your awareness changes the atmosphere because your presence changes. You become harder to influence through pressure, harder to pull into unnecessary conflict, harder to convince that repeated behavior is accidental. You listen differently. You respond differently. You value consistency more than promises and actions more than explanations. And when someone realizes they can no longer control how you see, interpret, or respond to what is happening, the dynamic they once relied on begins to lose its hold. One of the clearest moments of understanding does not happen when everything feels calm. It often happens when the usual patterns stop working and the reactions begin to change. People reveal a great deal when they realize they are no longer getting the response they expected. The moment they sense distance, stronger boundaries, or a different level of awareness, their reactions can become louder than their words. At first, the changes may seem subtle: a small increase in irritation, more questions about your choices, unexpected comments that make you second-guess yourself, a sudden need to revisit old conversations, attention that appears exactly when you become less available, concern that arrives only after you create space. What once looked ordinary starts to feel timed, repeated, and strangely familiar. This is where observation becomes important. When someone is used to influence, they often expect familiar responses. They expect quick reassurance, emotional engagement, endless explanation, or immediate repair after tension. But when those responses disappear, the pressure to restore the old pattern can become visible. You may notice blame replacing discussion. Instead of addressing what happened, attention shifts toward your reaction. Instead of accountability, there may be criticism. Instead of curiosity, there may be defensiveness. Questions become accusations. Boundaries become selfishness. Silence becomes disrespect. Your decision to protect your energy suddenly becomes the problem being discussed. That shift can feel confusing at first because the reactions seem disconnected from the situation. You may wonder why simple limits create strong emotions, why calm communication creates resistance, why choosing distance creates urgency. But reactions often reveal what words try to hide. When someone becomes uncomfortable with your clarity, they may increase the intensity of behaviors that once created results. Sometimes it appears as guilt, reminders of everything they have done for you, suggestions that you are changing or becoming difficult. Sometimes it appears as charm and unusual kindness designed to pull you back into familiar roles. Sometimes it appears as frustration, criticism, or emotional unpredictability. The important thing is not to focus only on individual moments. Look at patterns. Does respect remain consistent when you disagree? Does communication stay healthy when you set limits? Does concern exist only when access changes? Do difficult conversations lead to understanding or repeated redirection? Patterns answer questions that isolated moments cannot. Strong reactions do not automatically mean someone is harmful. People react for many reasons. But repeated resistance to accountability, repeated discomfort with boundaries, and repeated attempts to control how you think or feel deserve attention. Because healthy connection does not require confusion to survive. When someone values mutual respect, your growth does not threaten them. Your boundaries do not become attacks. Your clarity does not create panic. Your ability to think independently does not become a problem to solve. And when reactions become more intense, the more grounded, calm, and clear you become, those moments can reveal dynamics that were hidden during times when everything felt easier and more predictable. Boundaries are often misunderstood because people imagine them as walls, distance, or rejection. But real boundaries are not about controlling anyone else. They are about deciding what you will participate in, what you will accept, and what you will no longer carry. They are not punishments, they are decisions. And for many people, setting boundaries becomes the moment everything starts to change. At first, boundaries can feel uncomfortable, especially if you have been taught that being understanding means endless availability, that being kind means always saying yes, or that maintaining connection requires sacrificing your own peace. You may believe that protecting your energy is selfish, or that choosing limits means you are becoming cold. But boundaries do not remove care. They remove confusion. Without boundaries, patterns repeat. You explain more than necessary. You tolerate things that leave you drained. You ignore discomfort because you want harmony. You continue conversations that go nowhere. You allow access to your time, emotions, and attention, even when that access comes without respect or reciprocity. Over time, you begin adapting yourself to keep situations manageable while losing connection with your own needs. Boundaries interrupt that cycle. They begin in simple ways: saying no without extended explanations, choosing not to respond immediately, refusing to argue over your own experiences, deciding that not every criticism deserves a defense, allowing discomfort to exist without rushing to fix it, accepting that someone else's disappointment is not always your responsibility to solve. And something interesting happens when you start doing this. People begin responding differently. Those who respect you usually adjust. They may ask questions. They may need time to understand. But healthy relationships find ways to adapt because respect does not depend on unlimited access. Others may react with surprise. You may hear that you have changed, that you are distant, that you are difficult now, that you used to be easier to talk to. But sometimes what people miss is not connection. It is familiarity, familiar access, familiar responses, familiar patterns that benefited from your flexibility. Boundaries reveal expectations. The moment you stop over-explaining, some people become uncomfortable. The moment you stop accepting every emotional demand, pressure increases. The moment you stop carrying responsibility for everyone's experience, reactions become stronger. That does not mean your boundaries are wrong. Discomfort is not always a sign of damage. Sometimes it is simply evidence that a pattern no longer works. Strong boundaries also change your relationship with yourself. You begin listening to your own reactions instead of dismissing them. You trust discomfort instead of explaining it away. You become more selective with your time and attention. You stop measuring your value by how available you are to everyone else. You discover that peace does not always come from solving every conflict. Sometimes it comes from choosing not to enter one. And the more consistently you protect your time, your attention, your emotional space, and your standards, the more clearly you begin to see which relationships are built on mutual respect and which ones depended on your willingness to ignore yourself. Freedom rarely arrives as a dramatic moment. It does not always begin with leaving, speaking up, or making a major decision. More often, it starts with clarity, a quiet realization that changes the way you see everything. The moment you stop arguing with what you consistently experience, The moment you stop forcing explanations that no longer fit. The moment you allow yourself to trust your own observations. Clarity changes more than circumstances. It changes how you interpret behavior, how you respond to pressure, and how much influence outside opinions have over your choices. Before clarity, it is easy to stay trapped in cycles of confusion. You replay conversations. You search for hidden meanings. You question your memory. You convince yourself that if you communicate better, try harder, become more patient, or wait longer, things will eventually become clear. But clarity does not come from endless analysis. It comes from paying attention. You begin noticing what actually happens, instead of focusing only on what is promised. You stop measuring relationships by potential and start observing consistency. You notice whether words and actions align. You notice how people behave when they do not get what they want. You notice whether respect disappears during disagreement, or whether connection remains steady even in difficult moments. That awareness creates space. Space between what someone says and what you automatically believe. Space between pressure and your response. Space between guilt and your decisions. In that space, something powerful begins to grow. Trust. Not blind trust in others, but trust in yourself. You stop needing constant reassurance that your feelings make sense. You stop collecting opinions before making choices. You stop searching for permission to recognize patterns that repeat. You begin understanding that your experiences matter and that your perspective deserves consideration. Freedom grows from that place, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because confusion stops directing your decisions. You become less reactive and more intentional. You stop chasing closure from people who avoid accountability. You become comfortable with unanswered questions. You understand that not every situation will end with complete understanding, and not every person will explain themselves in a way that feels satisfying. You begin releasing the need to convince others of your reality. That shift creates energy. Energy that was once spent managing reactions, predicting moods, fixing misunderstandings, and maintaining impossible expectations becomes available again. You start investing in your own goals, your own growth, your own peace. You remember what it feels like to make choices without fear of constant approval or criticism. And with that comes a different kind of confidence. Not loud confidence, not performance. A steady confidence built from seeing clearly, responding intentionally, and recognizing that your ability to understand what you experience is not something that needs to be negotiated, defended, or handed over to someone else in order to be valid.